So what I'm going to talk about today is Leonardo da Vinci's Codex Trivulzianus. Really is sort of a blackboard of intellectual exploration, and you'll see how that sort of fits in a little bit from as we go forward. The goals really are to outline some of Leonardo's early life, because you'll see how that interacts with what we're going to talk about later on. I'm going to outline some of the scientific and social context in which Leonardo da Vinci's Codex was written in its history. I'm going to profile some of the thoughts of other authors as they grappled with the Codex, and you'll see that these multiple word lists and Latinisms. And Sal and I have written an article about the possibility that Leonardo had some type of dyslexia, and that was one of the reasons why we see these word lists. And I'm going to analyze the writings and illustrations of the Codex, really with an emphasis on just some medical and scientific things, but really to see how Leonardo was using this Codex as really a blackboard, as an attempt to look at different things and mix things up related to what he was thinking about at the time. Now, Paul Valéry, who's a French poet, wrote of Leonardo, what a man leaves after them, or what a person leaves after them, are the dreams that his name inspires and the works that make their name a symbol of admiration. So it would appear that if you want to leave something behind, it really involves two things. Your name has to inspire people to think about interesting, sort of innovative things. But on top of that, you have to have done something. You have had to sort of done some type of work that also remains. So really to the poetry of medicine, Leonardo contributed really a very small number of poems. To the art of the poetry of art, Leonardo contributed whole volumes. And to the poetry of the world, Leonardo could be considered to have contributed whole libraries. So in one way, there's what I'm going to talk about today is a very, very small part of Leonardo's contributions. So what I'm going to start about is Vasari, when he wrote his first life of painters and architects in 1550, he comments about Leonardo and says this: Leonardo was of heretical a cast of mind, that he conformed with no religion whatsoever, according that perchance much better to be a philosopher than a Christian. What's interesting in his second edition, this was taken out, and possibly because Vasari had the opportunity to discuss Leonardo with Melzi, Leonardo's favorite pupil, who you'll hear about again. And clearly Leonardo had some, let's say, religious feelings, maybe not quite as religious, related to what we might consider to be associated with what we think about others. So the bottom line was that this particular note was taken out of the second edition. And however, I think the fact that this note was in the first edition of 1550 probably had a significant effect on the ability to publish Leonardo's work, because the first work of Leonardo was actually published 130 years after his death. And clearly, having a comment in a very important book at that time, one of the more important books at that time, that Leonardo conformed to no religion, was probably not a positive thing to have placed in the book. When Vasari was writing of Leonardo, he basically says this: in the natural course of events, celestial influences rain down on human beings the greatest of gifts, but sometimes in a way that transcends nature, bestows on a single individual beauty, grace, and ability united with such lavish abundance that every action he turns his attention to is so divine that it surpasses that of all other men, clearly demonstrating that this genius is a gift from God. So it's interesting that Leonardo was gifted that particular time period, and the individuals who were associated with him at that period of time felt that he was clearly a very unique type of individual. Leonardo was probably born in a small town called Anciano. It's north of Florence. And as you can see here, it's sort of a little bit of a mountain town. And Anciano is a very, very small village about 2 kilometers away from it. And his mother was a 14 or 15-year-old girl who had gotten pregnant from Leonardo's father, and probably was sent to Anciano to have her baby. And then after she had her baby, Leonardo was baptized. The mother was not at the baptism, according to the grandfather's notes at the time. But Leonardo probably spent a number of years with his mother. First to be breastfed by his mother, and also probably living in Anciano and playing in Anciano. And one of the reasons for that was, one, he was illegitimate. Two, Leonardo's father was married very soon after Leonardo's birth to another woman. And Leonardo's grandfather probably didn't feel that his son should be involved in this type of activity very much. So he got married. He got married to a more prominent woman in Vinci. Leonardo's father was a lawyer and really didn't seem to have had a great deal of interest in him. He had, however, an uncle who was his father's brother, whose name was Francesco. And Francesco probably was the one who taught him at least some of the aspects of farming. He taught him probably some minimal reading and writing. To me, it's a little unclear as to whether Leonardo ever really went to school. And the reason for that is that he was dominantly left-handed. And I'm sure at that time, if you were dominantly left-handed and going to a school in which there were nuns, that they would have made a lot of attempt to switch you from being a left-hander to a right-hander. And Leonardo always used his left hand for painting, for drawing, for all his activities, and for the vast majority of his work. So probably he did not go to school very much. And in that particular situation, you'll see how that influences what happens later on. Now, Leonardo's father obviously figured out that he had some ability related to art, and he was sent to work in the workshop of Andrea della Verrocchio. And Andrea della Verrocchio was a very interesting individual. In fact, that he did everything. He did if you wanted a painting done, if you wanted sculpture done, if you wanted anything done, he was able in his workshop to do that. It was sort of like a bottega of all kinds of different works. And Leonardo was associated with working with him and studying under him. And this is the first sort of painting that Leonardo was felt to have had something to do with. And it relates to this particular angel on the left. And you don't see it so terribly well here unless you actually go there and actually see it in the Uffizi in Florence. But the difference between this angel and this angel is considered to be the sort of start of the High Renaissance. Because if you look carefully at this angel, you'll see, for example, that there are sort of crystals, sort of little buttons on this area. And if you're able to look carefully, there's reflections of light in this area. If you look at the hair, for example, very, very minor, again, you can't see it because of the quality of the picture here, but very, very minor, very interesting, intricate sort of abilities to really deal with the hair and how light would shine off the hair and light would shine off other objects. So this angel, compared to this, which is a classical angel at that time, you can see the appearance of the face, the hair, the way the hair is sort of curled. And this is one of the characteristics that Leonardo has throughout his life. So during this time in Verrocchio's studio, what would have happened is when he would have started painting and drawing, let's say, various types of sculpture that was available. Over time, in the corner here, he'd been asked to sort of begin to make paints and other aspects. And then he, as he got more advanced, he may have been able to, for example, to do the backgrounds in one particular part of a painting that Verrocchio was doing, for example. So that was that aspect of it. But the difficulty with Florence at the time was that the major academic language at the time was Latin. Leonardo had almost no knowledge or very little knowledge of Latin. And second, he was not schooled, so he wasn't involved in the academic year. So what basically happened is between the ages of 29 and 31, Leonardo decides to leave Florence for Milan. And although the reasons for that departure are not known, It may have been that his novelness and his ability to be creative and approach problems in these creative ways, in particular his problem with Latin, and also as a problem with authority. He always had some problems with authority, may have made it difficult for him to be accepted into the Tuscan academic community. And he writes a letter to Milan's ruler at the time, Ludovico Forza, who was also known as Ludovico di Moro. He outlines 9 items concerning his military ability. And then he outlines the 10th item. And the 10th item is interesting. And you read it here. Also, I can excuse sculpture in marble, bronze, and clay. Likewise, in painting, I can do everything possible, as well as any other, whoever he may be. Rather interesting for Leonardo to say that. He also says, moreover, work could be undertaken on the bronze horse, which will be to the immortal glory and eternal honor of the auspicious memory of his lordship, your father, and of the illustrious house of Sforza. You sort of get the impression that this may have tipped the balance and resulted in Leonardo going to Milan. Milan was a completely different place at that time than Florence. Leonardo was more based on the idea of being able to actually do things. It was a warlike environment, and of course, being able to make various types of armory and other things were very important. Milan was vibrant, and there's a monograph with Accademia Leonardi Vinci, which is present on 6 original engravings. And which was carried out in Milan. It has been suggested that Leonardo was involved in an academia, which is really a functioning school, while he was in Milan. And these sort of engravings may have functioned as tickets to attend these scientific disputations held under Leonardo's direction, or possibly even prizes for individuals who distinguished themselves in debates. Albert Dürer produced a series of woodcut copies of these engravings, which really further propagated both the images of and the idea of the school. Most of the images of early academias of art have a picture of Leonardo, as do many other issues associated with schools. This is Raphael's Sancho's stanza in the Vatican museums. And you can see Leonardo here represented in this situation, and you can see other individuals associated with this. So this would be Plato because he's carrying the Timaeus, for example. So Leonardo was considered obviously to have been associated with art academias and learning. However, the codex that we're talking about, what is a codex? So basically it's some type of a covering. It can be wooden covering, it can be any type of covering. And within this covering are sheets of paper. And these sheets of paper can be either free or later on they can be sort of sewn together as sort of a book-like form. So that's basically what a codex is. So this particular codex was written by Leonardo when he was about between the ages of 35 and 38 years old. This time he was preoccupied with self-improvement. He was interested in learning things and improving his overall vocabulary, and interested in the academic milieu, and also clearly with teaching the individuals who were affiliated with it. Leonardo's time, however, in Milan would soon end. What basically happened is Charles VIII dies, and Louis XII is crowned the King of France in 1498. Louis was not a friend of Ludovico Sforza at all. And Milan was stormed then by a general called Gian Giacomo Trivulzianus, and Ludovico was ousted from power. Because of Leonardo's sort of relationship with Ludovico, he also left Milan in haste. Now, Leonardo then would go to Florence. He'd go back to Milan, was in Rome for a while, and he finally died in Amboise. And this is one of the many depictions of Leonardo dying in the hands of Francis I. This did not happen. But what's interesting about this particular, the pictures and engravings that occur, and this was written by Vasari in his book that I described previously, is his faithful pupil, Melzi, is always at his side. Now, Melzi was at Leonardo's death, and Leonardo bequests to him all of his drawings, manuscripts, books, paintings, everything basically. And he writes, it's written in his will, the aforementioned testador gives and bequests to nobleman Messer Franco del Mezzo of Milan in remuneration for his services and favors done for him in the past, each and all books the testador has presently, and other instruments and portraits pertaining to his art as a painter. So when Leonardo dies, Melzi, and Leonardo dies in Amboise in France, Melzi is bequeathed all these instruments and portati that Leonardo outlined in his will. Now, Melzi returned to Italy sometime before 1523, a number of years after Leonardo's death, and he brought with him these inherited treasures and to his villa in Vaprio do Ada. Interestingly, the Melzi villa is still present. And if you go to Vaprio do Alda, which is a few miles outside of Milan, you can look up from the Alda, which is a river there, and you can see the Melzi family villa, which is still owned by the same family. Melzi spent the remaining part of his life there. Yeah, he carefully guarded Leonardo's treasures and embarked on deciphering the Leonardo's writings, which were right to left. It's interesting that you could consider that Melzi was more of an interpreter of Leonardo's art than actually innovative. For example, you can see at the top here, these are two of Leonardo's grotesques. And this is Melzi's interpretation of these two grotesques. This, for example, is Leonardo's drawings associated with cats, and this is Melzi's interpretation of cats. Basically a complete copyist of what Leonardo was doing. Now, Melzi had inherited at least 46 Leonardo's manuscripts. How do we know that? Well, Melzi marked each of the manuscripts that he had with a letter of the alphabet and a number. The Codex that we're talking about today was marked with the letter F. And it also was numbered inside as number 10. And initially he outlined all the pages, and the pages were numbered from 1 to 62. And he used parts of the Codex, parts that were associated with the art of painting, for the Libro di Pittura, which was the major work that Melzi was trying to do related to Leonardo's work. He was trying to sort of take Leonardo's ideas related to painting from all the different manuscripts that were available to him and put them into a document. This particular document was basically ready to be published. It had been gone through by a number of different editors, but it was never published. And part of why it was never published may have been related to that initial comment by Vasari, because that comment would have come out at about approximately the time where Melzi may have gotten his book ready to be published. After Melzi's death in about 1570, the Kodaks in many of the Leonardo volumes came into the hands of a sculptor from Spain by the name of Pompeo Leone. And he numbered the pages from 1 to 55. So by that time, already 7 of the pages that were in Leonardo's book that had been marked by Melzi were already missing. And at Leone's death, these volumes passed to Count Arconati, who later donated them to the Biblioteca Ambrosio in Milan, and we'll talk about that. So, interestingly, if you look again, these are the ones that now exist because we have their numbers. So we presently have 15 out of the 46 original Leonardo Libri and Librettini that sadly that can be identified. So at most, we only have 33% of these codexes by Leonardo. And rather interesting, only 2 of these are in Italy. So here's what they look like. You can see that other people have also marked them, but you can see they're sort of a ragtag of different sort of books. The vast majority that have ties on them, and some have been recovered since that time. So Count Arconati donated the 12 books that he's been able to get a hold of, 12 of these codexes, and which included manuscript F, the Codex that we're talking about here, to the Ambrosio Library. And I have a copy of the deed. I have the deed. And the deed outlines Arconati's reason for the donation. And if you look at the bottom, you can see the reason for a donation that is outlined. Basically saying that Arconati has donated these items to the Ambrosio Library so that they can be a perpetual benefit to mankind. Rather remarkable. An individual in the 17th century would consider donating these volumes for that purpose, so they can be a perpetual benefit to mankind. And in fact, if he hadn't done this, probably would have had almost none of Leonardo's books whatsoever. The second thing is, in the second page, he outlines each of these volumes that have been donated. And number 5 is the Codex that we're talking about here. And basically what it says, there's a similar volume in quarto, and it has 54 leaves. So again, it's already lost some more leaves. The first leaves, there are some grotesque drawings of heads, and it's inscribed on the spine, Leonardo da Vinci. Now, Arconati had reserved the right to take any of his donated manuscripts home whenever he wished. And at his death, this Libro 5, the one we're talking about, had disappeared from the Biblioteca Ambrosiana. And it was only to reappear about 100 years later. And at that time, it was in the hands of a Prince Carlo Trivulzio, who you see has relationships to the Consistory who was involved in storming Milan. And this particular volume is now in the Biblioteca Trivulziana in the Castello Sforza in Milan. So this particular volume is presently in Milan in the Castello Sforza. Now, because it was there in the Count's private library, it was studied by a number of scholars. And J.B. Venturi, who is associated with Venturi effect, commented in his private notes that the Codex was composed of about 50 folios, and about 20 of those folios were vocabula. In other words, this is the first time we really know that there's these word lists in the book, and 30 of them were associated with drawings on various subjects. Now, Carlo Amirati refers to the Codex in the introduction of Gerles Disegno and Disegni di Leonardo da Vinci. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about these pages that have vocabula. They can have drawings. They don't necessarily have the drawings, but you can see these little large numbers of words and word lists that are present. So when Carlo was talking about this, he basically commented that a good part of the work is occupied by a species of dictionary that we do not know how to understand its purpose. And this is one of the reasons that it's an interesting concept. What are all these words about? Why are they all there? Bossi, who published The Last Supper, the De Cenacula by Leonardo da Vinci, had wanted to use some of the work that was in this particular codex for another sort of volume to his book, but he never managed to do that, although it's in his notes. So what happened to the Codex? Well, when Napoleon's army entered Milan in 1796, they really pillaged the Leonardo collection of his house in the Biblioteca Ambrosio. And all of Leonardo's manuscript left for France, many of them never to return. However, Codex F had been removed from the Biblioteca and remained in Milan to be studied, and therefore it was not, and never has been in France. One of the things I can say, I've always been somewhat interested in the idea that, Napoleon comes to Milan, he takes all of Leonardo's stuff along with massive amounts of other things. It's thought that 10,000 paintings and other items left northern Italy at the time of Napoleon, and the vast majority of them have never been returned. You wonder why Italy doesn't ask for them all back, but that's another story. Since the Codex was still there, an individual by the name of Gilberto Govi, when he looked at the book, suggested that Leonardo was attempting to record spoken language, idioms that were spoken in Vinci and Florence. It was really a type of a spoken dictionary, opposed to the language of the literati. A number of individuals supported this particular concept. But Agostino Marionati in 1944 proposed that the Codex was not indeed a dictionary of the spoken word, but was Leonardo's attempt to study and learn Latinisms. By his own account, considered himself an homo senza lettura, an unlearned man. So these are what we're dealing with here, a number of different ideas there on one side. Now, there's also been some psychoanalytic interpretations of these word lists. And an individual in France by the name of Henri de Gelmuller in 1895 was really the first to suggest that Leonardo was putting together notes from books that he was reading and on the different folios. And he comments, concerning these word lists, Leonardo sought to grasp the relationship between different sounds and the emotions of the soul. Through the secrets of language, Leonardo seeks to finally penetrate this mysterious region of the interior man, where we live, our feelings, our ideas are born, and thoughts develop. In 1970, an individual by the name of Stykes put forward a somewhat interesting sort of reinterpretation of these word lists, and they were really based on Freud. Basic concept that one of the reasons that Leonardo was so productive academically was because of the fact that when he was a young child, then moved from his mother to another family when he was about 3 to 5 years old, and the trauma that was associated with that. And because of his sublimation of that trauma, he used he developed another aspect of his intellectual life, which was really his art. Stykes basically felt that these word lists and associations were a defense mechanism, and that Leonardo employed to deal with the psychological trauma that I talked about, and also to his love life. So it's interesting that this idea of this sublimation, these psychological traumas that Leonardo may have as a young child, were felt to in some way be associated with these long word lists. Now, the Codex itself was transcribed, photographed, and published for the first time in 1891. What's interesting was the first one to be transcribed and photographed and really set the standard for all the work that was to be done in almost the next sort of century related to Leonardo's manuscripts. And basically the idea was that you on one page had Leonardo's work, and then you were able to transcribe it into whatever language you wanted to transcribe it with and translate it. And also, if you, for example, had one of Leonardo's pages, that you would transcribe each of the notes that were present there, and there were various ways of doing that. Followed by the name of de Toni published a new translation, which corrected a lot of these sort of so-called errors. And in 1968, the Commissione Vinciana published facsimile, along with a new interpretation of the work at that particular period of time. So if you open up the Codex, the very first page looks like this. And I'm just going to talk about a few things, some of the medical things, some of the scientific things, architectural things, and these word lists, predominantly these word lists. So you can see here that we have a number of Leonardo's grotesques, which are very common. One of the things that I've been particularly interested in almost all my whole life was to why Leonardo was so fascinated by these grotesques. And it also has here, for example, instruments is associated with a boat. There's other drawings related to triangles and circles, etc. here. But if you begin to see what he said, and here in basic comments, Arminius Barcellinus states that 700,000 volumes of books were burned in the siege of Alexandria in the time of Julius Caesar. Second note here. If Petrarch loved laurel so well, it was because it was good with sausage and thrushes. I cannot prize these foolish words. Here he comments about 5 different books that he has in his library. And these, one of them, Donatellus, is a vocabulary, a Latin vocabulary. And he's taken some of the words from this particular book in his word list, and we'll talk about that. And this one is an interesting one. It's either savage is he who saves himself, or the first word is difficult to decipher, or is saved is he who saves himself. I like the second definition a little bit better. The second page, as soon as you turn the page over, this is what you see. So you can see here, there's obviously writing here, and there's other instruments and 3-dimensional drawings, etc. So the writing really is from a Roman author who was interested in medicine by the name of Celsus. And basically said, what Leonardo is doing here is copying some of the work here. The greatest good is wisdom. The greatest evil is the suffering of the body, because we being composed of 2 things, that is, of soul and of body, of which the first is better and worst is the body. What's interesting here, if you go through Celsus really doesn't say this. Leonardo has reinterpreted what Celsus had said. So Leonardo doesn't necessarily copy all the time. He sort of has read it, or someone has read it to him, and he has interpreted it in his own way. The second thing you see here is sort of a clamp that he's developed, and you can see it here how it becomes that. You turn the page again, and there's a number of these pages that are completely empty. So about 7 of the pages that we have now have no writing on them, and that may be because Leonardo hadn't filled these pages yet, obviously. And this is another one that here he's talking really about the lover, subject with form. The lover moves towards a thing loved as a sensible object moves into the senses. So again, you can see he's thinking about various concepts and ideas. This is another, you go to the next page, this is what you see. And in this particular page, what you see is an eclipse. And Leonardo is sort of commenting about, if you're looking at eclipse, the method for seeing the sun eclipse without pain to the eye, take a sheet of paper and make a hole in it with a needle and look at the sun through these holes. So again, Leonardo is, thinking about various ways of dealing, for example, with looking at an eclipse. But the vast majority of Leonardo's Codex is associated with these word lists, but there also is a portion of it that's associated with when he was dealing with making drawings for one of the cathedrals in Milan. But this is what most of the pages look like. So how do you put this all together? So if one can summary it as sort of a blackboard of intellectual exploration, this book is really a fundamental testimony of what Leonardo is reading, what his relationship is with these books, with medicine, with science, with architecture, with language. And on these 51 pages, there are literally thousands of words. In fact, one of the individuals has counted them. There's over 8,000. These word lists were from a number of books that Leonardo had in his library. One is the Re Militario by Valturio. About 1,000 words come from there, and words come from a number of other books that Leonardo had in his library. And one can think about them really as he's trying to jumpstart his journey. He was trying to fill his gap of knowledge in classical and humanistic culture. And he wants to more appear as a man of letters in his teaching and writing of his contemporaries. But Leonardo was always interested in light and always interested in sound. And multiple words were duplicated. The tenses were changed, as were the verbs, suggesting that Leonardo liked the sound of words and may have been using sound repetition to help him remember these important words. So the repetition and changing words as he was doing it. So he may have been, reorganized these multiple words really with the idea of having them as sort of a dictionary or a thesaurus of learned words to try to sort of improve his expression related to high communication that he was trying to learn at that time. So Rakai in particular knows about the Blackboard that is presently in our lab, along with some of the other people. And there were many, many times when we all sat in front of the Blackboard for all kinds of reasons and came out with ideas. I love Blackboards. I think they're one way that we can communicate and write and rub off and new ideas. And this happened to be a day when I had a number of other sort of prints related Leonardo in my possession, and we were looking at those two in the lab. So what are Blackboards used for? It's rather fascinating. The first Blackboard that was used was in about 1800. So in Leonardo's time, there's no such thing as a Blackboard. So these books were sort of used as Blackboards. They were used for ideas and for rewriting and all this type of thing. So as a child, as you might remember, you love Blackboards. You write on Blackboards and you write all kinds of things, numbers, all kinds of things. As you grow up a little bit, the Blackboard, what you wrote on a Blackboard becomes a little bit more complex. And then sometimes, including myself, I wrote on Blackboards many times, and I was being taught by nuns such words as "I will not fight again" and things like that. And sometimes Blackboards are used for very, very intellectual sort of types of work. So, Leonardo really is a sort of a harbinger of Blackboards to come related to the use of his multiple sort of codexes that he carried around with him for his whole life. And what's amazing is how many did he not, he got rid of or lost or whatever during his life, if we know at least 46 that were present. So to finish up, one of Leonardo's interesting notes was that it is a mediocre pupil who does not exceed his master. I've turned that around a little bit, and I'm sure that Sal believes the same, that it's a mediocre teacher whose pupils do not exceed him or her. So from a teacher's point of view, the best thing you can always have is students that actually are better than you are and move whatever field we're talking about forward from that aspect. And so I'll just finish up with this. What a person leaves after them are the dreams that their name inspires and the works that make their name a symbol of admiration.